"We need to discuss your threatening behavior toward the production supervisor during yesterday's safety meeting," said Ruth Martinez, our human resources manager. Her voice had that practiced neutrality that somehow made everything sound worse than it actually was. I sat there staring at her, genuinely confused. What threatening behavior? I'd barely said 10 words during that meeting. She slid a printed incident report across the table. Someone had highlighted phrases in bright yellow words describing how I'd aggressively confronted Helen Foster about minor equipment concerns and made veiled threats about consequences if she didn't back down from her position. "This wasn't me," I said, keeping my voice level despite the tension building in my chest. I asked about the stress test results on the new harnesses. That's it. "3 supervisors independently reported your hostile demeanor and threatening language," Ruth replied, tapping her pen against the paper. "That's fairly conclusive evidence, Warren." My heart rate spiked. I recognized what was happening here. 3 supervisors, all in Helen's pocket, all willing to lie to protect the woman who'd been cutting corners on safety equipment for months. Let me back up. My name's Warren Dalton, and I'm 47 years old. I've been a quality engineer at Apex Safety Systems for 8 years now, ever since my divorce when I needed steady work to support my 2 sons. Before that, I did 20 years in the Navy, mostly working on equipment maintenance and safety protocols. When you've seen what happens when gear fails at the wrong moment, and I have you develop a zero-tolerance policy for cutting corners. That attitude served me well at Apex until 3 months ago, when Helen Foster got promoted to production supervisor. Helen had been lobbying hard to fast-track our expansion into the Mexican construction market, and upper management loved her aggressive timelines and cost projections. What they didn't see was how she planned to hit those numbers. I first noticed problems during routine quality checks on our new line of safety harnesses. These weren't just any harnesses. They were designed for oil rig workers and high-rise construction crews. The kind of equipment where a single failure means someone's family gets a phone call they never want to receive. The stress test data didn't add up. Our specifications called for a minimum braking strength of 5,000 pounds, but the test reports showed multiple units failing at 3,800 pounds. When I brought this to Helen's attention, she dismissed it immediately. "Those are preliminary results," she said, barely looking up from her computer. "The Mexican market has different standards anyway. We're meeting all required specifications." Something about her casual dismissal set off every alarm bell I'd developed during my Navy years. This wasn't about market standards, this was about cutting costs, and hoping nobody noticed until it was too late. I did what any responsible engineer would do. I pulled the complete testing records and spent my weekend reviewing them. What I found made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the harnesses. Safety helmets were showing impact resistance 30% below specification. Fall protection cables were fraying under loads they should handle easily. And the inspection reports, all signed off as acceptable for international markets. When I scheduled a meeting with Helen on Monday morning, I brought documentation. Test results, specification sheets, photos of failed equipment. I laid it all out on her desk and waited for her to explain how this qualified as acceptable. "Warren," she said, her voice taking on that tone people use when they're about to explain something to a slow child. "You've been here 8 years. I've been with this company for 15. I understand the bigger picture in ways you might not appreciate." "The bigger picture doesn't change physics," I replied. "A harness that fails at 3,800 pounds will kill someone, regardless of which market we're selling it to." That's when her expression hardened. Some friendly advice. Know when to stay in your lane. Production supervisors handle these decisions for a reason. The meeting ended with her promising to look into it, but I could tell from her body language nothing was going to change. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched as shipment after shipment of substandard equipment headed out to our Mexican distributors. Each truck that left our loading dock felt like a countdown timer to disaster. I tried a different approach, reaching out to Steve Walsh, Helen's second-in-command, hoping he might see reason. We met in the break room during lunch, away from Helen's usual surveillance. "Look," he said, lowering his voice and glancing around nervously. "Everyone knows those test requirements are just starting points. We have local partners down there who handle the real approvals. But the lab tests clearly show our materials would fail under actual working conditions." I insisted, pulling out my documentation. Steve's expression hardened. "Warren, some friendly advice from someone who's survived here longer than you. Know when to follow directions. Helen has connections you couldn't imagine. Don't make yourself a problem she needs to solve." That night, I found something tucked under my windshield wiper in the parking garage. A plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Some careers end before they begin. Smart people know when to keep quiet." I sat in my truck for nearly an hour, that paper shaking in my hands, wondering what I'd stumbled into and who I could possibly trust. The threatening note was my breaking point. I called my brother Danny, the only person I trusted completely with this situation. Danny had done his own 20 years in the Army and understood the weight of equipment failure. When I told him about the threatening note and the systematic safety violations, his response was immediate and clear. Document everything, he said. Every test result, every conversation, every email. Save it all in multiple places. And then what I asked, pacing around my small apartment kitchen. Find someone higher up the chain who gives a damn about keeping people alive. Following his advice, I began keeping meticulous records. I saved emails showing how test data was being manipulated. I photographed equipment that had failed inspection. I compiled evidence of a systematic pattern of cost-cutting that put workers' lives at risk. Every night after work, I'd spend hours organizing documentation, building an ironclad case. The more I dug, the worse it got. I discovered Helen's team had been falsifying safety certificates for months. They'd created a separate testing protocol for international markets that used lower standards than our domestic requirements. When equipment failed their reduced tests, they'd simply adjust the numbers until they passed. But I also noticed something else. Every time I accessed certain files or ran specific database queries, there seemed to be unusual system activity. Log entries that didn't match my actions. Security protocols that felt more sophisticated than our usual IT setup. It was subtle, but my Navy training had taught me to pay attention to patterns that didn't fit. 2 weeks after finding the note, I was called to what I thought would be another routine meeting with Helen. Instead, she'd arranged a surprise presentation to Paul Davidson, our regional manager who'd flown in from corporate. The conference room was packed with supervisors, engineers, and production staff. Helen controlled the presentation with her usual polished confidence, clicking through slides that painted a picture of perfect execution. Revenue projections, delivery schedules, customer satisfaction scores, everything looked fantastic on paper. Our Mexican expansion is ahead of schedule and under budget, she announced, her voice filled with practiced enthusiasm. We're projected to capture 40% of the construction safety market within 18 months. Paul Davidson, a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the demeanor of someone who'd climbed the corporate ladder through pure determination, leaned forward with interest. Those are impressive numbers, Helen. What's driving that kind of market penetration? Competitive pricing combined with rapid deployment capabilities, Helen replied smoothly. We've streamlined our approval processes to match local market requirements. That's when she turned to look directly at me, and I knew what was coming. And now, she said, her smile never wavering, Warren will update us on our quality assurance protocols for the Mexican market. My stomach dropped. This was the first I'd heard about presenting anything. She was putting me on the spot, probably hoping I'd either stay quiet or make myself look bad in front of Davidson. I stood up, acutely aware of every eye in the room. Thank you, Helen. While I don't have prepared slides, I can share that our recent testing has identified some significant safety concerns that need to be addressed before we continue shipping. The room went dead, quiet. Paul Davidson's expression shifted from casual interest to sharp attention. What kind of safety concerns? Before I could answer, Helen jumped in smoothly. Warren is referring to some preliminary test results that have since been superseded by more comprehensive analysis. All our equipment meets or exceeds Mexican safety standards. Actually, I said clearly, my voice carrying across the silent room, our safety harnesses are consistently failing stress tests at 3,800 pounds when they're rated for 5,000. That's not preliminary data, that's a documented pattern across multiple production runs. Helen's smile never faltered, but I saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. I think there's some confusion about which test standards apply to different international markets. Everything is proceeding according to approved specifications. Paul Davidson's voice cut through the tension like a blade. I'd like to see both sets of test results. This afternoon, of course, Helen replied without missing a beat. We'll have everything compiled and sent to your office within the hour? After the meeting broke up, Helen cornered me by the elevator bank. Her friendly supervisor mask had completely disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. What exactly do you think you're playing at? She asked, her voice low but intense enough to make nearby conversations stop. Doing my job, I replied, keeping my voice steady. Those test results haven't been superseded by anything, and you know it. Your job is quality engineering, not production policy. Sometimes optimistic projections are necessary to maintain momentum and market confidence. The technical details get worked out during implementation. These aren't technical details, Helen. These are safety standards that exist because people die when equipment fails. She stepped closer, and for a moment I saw something dangerous flash in her eyes. Warren, you need to decide whether you're part of this team's success story or whether you're going to be remembered as the engineer who couldn't adapt to modern business realities. Not everyone is cut out for the demands of rapid international expansion. The threat was clear, even wrapped in corporate speak. That evening, I found myself staring at my phone, torn between calling Paul Davidson directly and following the chain of command. My ex-wife Sandra had always said I was too rigid about following rules, but Navy training runs deep. You don't skip levels unless someone's life is in immediate danger. But as I sat there thinking about those harnesses heading to construction sites across Mexico, I realized someone's life was in immediate danger, multiple someones, workers who trusted that their safety equipment would actually keep them safe. I started drafting an email to Davidson laying out everything I'd discovered: test failures, falsified reports, Helen's systematic circumvention of safety protocols. But before I could send it, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Apex Safety Systems, but it wasn't a number I recognized. Mr. Dalton, this is Barbara Stone from Corporate Legal. I understand you've raised some concerns about our international product compliance. Could you meet with me tomorrow morning? I stared at the phone for a long moment after Barbara Stone hung up. Corporate Legal calling me directly was either very good news or very bad news, and I wasn't sure which scared me more. The next morning, I arrived at the legal department 15 minutes early. Barbara Stone turned out to be a sharp-looking woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of intense focus that made you understand why she'd risen to corporate counsel. Mr. Dalton, she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk, I understand you've discovered some concerning irregularities in our international product line. That's one way to put it, I replied, setting down the thick folder I'd brought. I've documented systematic safety violations that could get people killed. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Before we proceed, I need to ask, have you shared this information with anyone outside the company? No, I've been trying to work through proper channels. Good. What I'm about to tell you requires complete confidentiality. She leaned back in her chair. You're not the first person to raise concerns about Helen Foster's production methods. We've been conducting a preliminary investigation for the past month. My mind raced. You already knew? We suspected, but suspicion and proof are different things. The documentation you've compiled could be exactly what we need to take action. She explained that corporate had been monitoring unusual patterns in our international shipping reports. Products approved for export that should have required additional testing. Inspection certificates that didn't match internal quality control records. Financial discrepancies in Helen's department budget. The problem, Barbara continued, is that Helen has cultivated significant political support within the company. She has allies on the board, relationships with key clients, a network that would make direct confrontation challenging. So what are you saying? We need ironclad evidence of willful safety violations before we can move, and we need it presented in a way that leaves no room for political maneuvering. Over the next hour, Barbara outlined a plan that made my Navy-trained mind appreciate the beauty of a well-executed operation. They would arrange for federal oversight to witness Helen's operation firsthand. OSHA inspectors, Mexican safety officials, international regulators who could verify violations in real time. The key, Barbara explained, is that Helen needs to believe she's in complete control when everything falls apart around her. What do you need from me? Keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Continue raising safety concerns through normal channels. Document Helen's responses, and when the time comes, be ready to present your findings to federal authorities. I left that meeting feeling something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Finally, someone with actual power was taking this seriously. That optimism lasted exactly 3 days. That's when I received the email that changed everything. Warren, please report to HR tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss some personnel concerns. Ruth Martinez. The night before the HR meeting, I sat at my kitchen table going through my documentation one more time. Photos of failed equipment, test results showing systematic failures, email chains proving Helen knew about the problems. Everything was organized, copied, and stored in multiple locations, just like Danny had advised. My phone buzzed with a text from my son Jake, now 18 and working his first construction job. Dad, the new safety harnesses our crew got are awesome. Way better than the old ones. You guys really know what you're doing. I stared at that message for a long time. Jake was trusting his life to equipment that might have come from our facility, equipment that might have been signed off by Helen's team without proper testing. The personal stakes couldn't have been clearer. The next morning, I walked into HR with my documentation folder and a recording device I'd legally checked could be used in our state. Ruth Martinez greeted me with that professional smile that somehow made everything feel ominous. Warren, thank you for coming. We need to discuss some concerning reports about your recent behavior. That's when she slid the incident report across the table, the one accusing me of threatening behavior toward Helen. As I read through the fabricated account of my supposed aggression, I realized this was Helen's insurance policy. If I became too much of a problem, she'd have me terminated for workplace violence. My credibility would be destroyed before I could expose anything. 3 supervisors have independently confirmed these incidents. Ruth continued. Steve Walsh, Diana Cross, and Kevin Murphy all reported feeling intimidated by your confrontational approach to production decisions. I kept my voice level despite the fury building in my chest. This is completely fabricated. I've never threatened anyone in this company. The pattern of behavior suggests otherwise. Helen has tried to work with you on adapting to our new international protocols, but your resistance has created a hostile work environment. My resistance? I've been documenting safety violations that could. That's exactly the kind of aggressive confrontation that's been reported. Ruth interrupted. Warren, this is serious. We're looking at potential termination for cause. I felt the trap closing around me. Helen had planned this perfectly. Discredit the whistleblower before he could blow the whistle. That's when the door opened without a knock. George Whitman, our CEO, stepped into the room. His unexpected presence made Ruth jolt upright in her chair, smoothing her already neat blazer. I'd seen George exactly twice in my 8 years at the company during all-hands meetings, where he spoke from a distant podium. Sir, we're in the middle of a disciplinary meeting, Ruth said, her voice suddenly uncertain. Actually, George said quietly, his voice filling the small room despite its low volume, we need to talk about something else entirely. He took the chair beside me rather than behind Ruth's desk, a positioning that immediately shifted the power dynamic in the room. Warren has been working directly with my office for the past month on my explicit instructions. I kept my expression neutral, though my mind raced. I had done no such thing. I'm not sure I understand, sir, Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. You will, George replied, then turned to me. Warren, would you mind waiting outside for a moment and please call Barbara Stone in legal? Tell her it's time. As I stood to leave, he added, tell her to bring everything we discussed. I stepped into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind me. Through the frosted glass, I could see their silhouettes, George leaning forward, Ruth shrinking back in her chair. Whatever was happening in there, it wasn't what I'd expected when I received that ominous HR summons. My hands shook as I dialed Barbara Stone's extension. When she answered, her voice was crisp and ready. Warren. Perfect timing. Conference room C, immediately. And bring everything. When I arrived at the conference room, Barbara was arranging documents on the table, but she wasn't alone. A man in a rumpled suit stood examining safety equipment samples that I recognized from our production line. Warren Dalton, meet Carl Thompson from OSHA's Regional Enforcement Division, Barbara said. He's been conducting a preliminary investigation into safety violations at our facility. Carl shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who'd spent years dealing with corporate executives trying to dance around regulations. Mr. Dalton, your documentation has been extremely helpful. When you access those test failure records, it triggered automatic alerts in our oversight system. I stared at him. OSHA has been monitoring our internal systems. For the past 6 weeks, Barbara explained. When patterns emerged suggesting systematic safety fraud, federal authorities became involved. Your evidence provided the final pieces we needed. The door opened and 3 more people entered, officials I didn't recognize but whose bearing suggested serious authority. Barbara made introductions. Mr. Rodriguez from the Mexican Construction Safety Board, Ms. Davis from OSHA's International Division, and Mr. Ricci from the Construction Workers Union. These gentlemen have taken time from extremely busy schedules, Barbara said, to witness what we believe will be a definitive demonstration of safety protocol violations. Carl checked his watch. Right about now, Helen Foster is being called to an emergency board meeting. She'll have no time to prepare her usual explanations. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a company-wide email. Emergency board meeting. All department heads report to conference room A immediately. She's walking into it right now, Barbara said with grim satisfaction. We moved as a group to the boardroom gallery, a small observation area with one-way glass that let us watch board meetings without being seen. Helen was already at the podium, her usual confident demeanor intact as she addressed the 12 board members. Thank you for accommodating this schedule change, she said smoothly. I'm prepared to address any concerns about our Mexican market expansion. Harold Grant, the board chairman, gestured toward the officials seated at the far end of the table. Before we begin, I'd like you to meet some guests who are very interested in your safety protocols. Helen's smile flickered as she noticed the unfamiliar faces, but she recovered quickly. Wonderful. International collaboration is exactly what this expansion is about. Mr. Rodriguez smiled politely. We're particularly interested in your quality assurance procedures. For the next 20 minutes, Helen delivered a masterful presentation on paper. Revenue projections, market penetration strategies, customer satisfaction metrics. Everything looked perfect in her carefully crafted slides. Our streamlined approval process, she concluded, allows us to meet international market-specific requirements while maintaining competitive pricing. That's when Barbara stood up in the boardroom. Before we adjourn, I believe we need to address some critical safety concerns that have come to light. When Helen hesitated, Harold Grant nodded firmly. "Please proceed, Miss Stone." Barbara connected her tablet to the room's display system. The first document that appeared was a safety test report showing systematic equipment failures. Harnesses breaking at 3,800 pounds instead of 5,000. Helmets cracking under impacts they should easily absorb. These documents detail a deliberate strategy to ship non-compliant safety equipment to international markets while falsifying inspection reports, Barbara explained with devastating calm. Mr. Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression darkening as he studied the data. Equipment that could kill construction workers. "There must be some mistake," Helen said quickly. "I've never seen these specific reports." Barbara swiped to the next screen, email chains with Helen's name clearly visible, discussing how to manage test results that don't meet traditional standards and optimize approval timelines for market demands. "The server logs confirm authenticity," Barbara replied, "as do sworn statements from production supervisors who came forward yesterday in exchange for immunity." At this, Helen's head snapped towards Steve Walsh and Diana Cross in the front row. Steve stared at the table, refusing to meet her eyes. Diana looked back with what might have been defiance or relief. For the next 30 minutes, Barbara systematically dismantled Helen's entire operation. Production schedules that prioritized speed over safety, budget manipulations that funded falsified inspections, a systematic pattern of endangering workers' lives for profit margins. Throughout it all, Helen attempted various defenses: denial, claims of misunderstanding, suggestions that competitors were framing her. With each new piece of evidence, her protest grew more desperate. When Barbara finished, the silence in the room felt heavy enough to crush stone. Mr. Rodriguez spoke first. "In Mexico, we take construction worker safety very seriously. Had this equipment reached our sites as planned, the consequences would have been catastrophic. We'll require complete transparency and significant oversight before considering any future approvals," Ms. Davis added. George Whitman, who had been silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. "You'll have both. We're implementing complete restructuring of our production and safety departments, effective immediately." Helen made one final attempt. "This is clearly a misunderstanding that can be resolved with proper context and additional review. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings," George said quietly. "Your employment is terminated immediately." The aftermath moved quickly. Helen, Steve, and Diana were escorted out by security. The federal officials scheduled follow-up inspections. Board members approved the complete restructuring George had promised, and Harold Grant called me forward. "Mr. Dalton, the board would like to offer you the position of Executive Vice President of Safety and Compliance. You'll report directly to the board with full authority over all safety protocols." 6 months later, our completely redesigned safety equipment began entering international markets with the highest ratings in the industry. The additional development costs ran into millions, but as George noted during our launch celebration, integrity isn't expensive, it's priceless. Last week, I received an email from a construction supervisor in Guadalajara. His crew had been working on a 15-story office building when a worker's harness caught him during a 40-foot fall. The equipment held perfectly. The worker went home that night with nothing worse than bruises and a story his grandkids would never believe. That evening, I called my sons to share the news. Jake, now 19 and working full-time construction, said something that made every sleepless night worth it. "Dad, I'm proud to wear gear from your company. I know it'll actually keep me safe. Sometimes standing up for what's right costs you everything you think you want. But living with yourself afterward is a hell of a lot easier when you know you did the right thing. When safety equipment fails, people die, and that's not negotiable, no matter what market pressures you're facing or what career advancement is on the line. If you've ever faced a choice between doing what's right and doing what's easy, I'd be interested to hear how you handled it. Sometimes knowing you're not alone in facing those moments makes all the difference. The truth has a way of coming out eventually. The only question is whether you'll be on the right side when it does."